So, hello and welcome. I'm delighted that you're here to join Alex Hill and myself. I'm Tim Leunig, I'm the Chief Analyst and Chief Scientific Advisor at the Department for Education. Last year, Alex and his colleagues burst onto the scene of education research with a very interesting paper in Harvard Business Review. It was a surprise to all of us in our area because we'd never heard of Alex and his co-authors, we didn't know the paper was coming, and the findings were genuinely challenging and interesting. Since then, I've been bombarded with questions from colleagues in the department, other researchers, pupils in schools, saying, what do you think of this research? So I'm here today to put some of those questions to Alex so that people can make up their own mind about whether his research is good and particularly whether it's useful to them in the context that they find themselves in. So, Alex, thank you for being interviewed today.
Pleasure.
First question, why on earth did you and your colleagues decide, a few years ago now, we're going to work on education?
So it's the Centre for High Performance was set up around 4 or 5 years ago, and the initial motivation for doing that was to try and work out how do you create and sustain high performance in organisations. And a colleague at the time was coaching some of the coaches of the British Olympic team, and he said to me in the run-up to 2012, I think something really interesting is happening, and let's go in and see if they'll let us see what's going on. So we spent some time with a gentleman called Peter Keane, who had started the transformation of British cycling and then worked at UK Sport and developed an investment model looking at how could you predict the number of medals teams would win. And we spoke to Peter and talked about what he'd done and the impact he'd had and where he felt there was learning elsewhere, which led us to look at the arts because his view was that they've sustained high performance for a very long time. But also, the opportunity came when Ben Laker came to Kingston to do his Masters, and I taught him, and then I supervised his dissertation. And at that time, Ben was working with schools, and we started to be able to see that there was a very interesting data set there. And from a researcher point of view, when you're looking at how do you improve an organisation, how do you create high performance, the nice thing about schools is it's very unusual that you have a large number of organisations that are actually trying to do something similar. And also, it's very unusual that they are regulated. Yep. And that they have to record information and they have to record it in a particular way so it's consistent. So you can really start to compare and contrast. Also, what's very unusual, which you don't get in the private sector, is when organisations fail in the private sector, they tend to disappear.
They do.
Whereas in the public sector, they don't often. So what you have is you have an external regulator who says these schools have failed, and so you've got that starting point, and then those schools are allowed or given the opportunity to try and improve what they do. So from our point of view, we just thought it was fascinating. And interestingly, when we first came to write it up for Harvard Business Review, we actually wrote a piece that was the learning from the schools for other organisations, and we were pulling in examples there of people like Apple, yep, who'd done the turnaround, or Harley Davidson, or Lloyd's Bank, yep, or Lego, and they were actually ones where we said, look, there's a similar transformation that's gone on here, and we think there's learning from schools. And it was actually Harvard Business Review who said, we think you should write it for schools because we don't think that there is a good evidence-based work yet around school transformation and leadership. So they were the ones that said, actually, we think this would be interesting. And then we focused in on the schools.
And we obviously are delighted that you did.
Yeah.
So all of these schools, as I understand it, have been put into what we call special measures by
That's correct. Yeah.
And you then, how did you get in touch with these schools? Did you write to them out of the blue?
So we approached them. The thing that we had was, because Ben had been working with schools, he had some relationships. Yes. So what we did is we started to use the relationships that we had and we approached the individual schools. And we said to them, we're really interested in looking at how do you turn around something that's been said that this is failing. So how do you turn it around? And we just said to them, could we see what you do, the actions you take, and the impact that they have, and could we get an understanding as to why you're taking those actions? So we approached each school individually, and one of the things that we were very clear on, was that this is we weren't going to reveal who the individuals were or who the schools were, but they were very interested too, because I think the challenge as any leader really is particularly in a turnaround situation, it's a very intense experience. So you're trying to run a school that's not working and try and change it, and you've got a lot of pressure from parents, from Ofsted, from everyone around you, and the expectations are high, the timescales are short. So these people are very much in the thick of it, and I think they were curious to know too, actually, what does work and what doesn't work, because in many instances they were going on their guts, their gut instincts. And it's very important, I think, to stress that they were all doing what they thought was right.
Absolutely. I have never met a teacher or head teacher who decides to do something that they know is wrong.
I've actually never met anyone in any organisation who turns up and says, I'm going to do a bad job today. Everyone turns up wanting to do the best job they can. They often just don't know what they're meant to be doing or how to do it. So the logic was really to try and understand actions, because actions are more concrete.
Absolutely.
And you can see them. So you can and focus really in on the actions and see the impacts that they had. But then what we started to notice was that...
So let's go back a stage before we go on to that. So how many schools did you end up working with, roughly?
We worked with 160.
160 schools with how many leaders?
411 leaders.
411. And they're all head teachers? Or
they were all... So what we found, we looked at 160 schools over a 7 to 9 year period. And so you've got, in some instances, they would have been led by 2, 3 individuals during that time, and we focused on just looking at the principal, so the equivalent of the head teacher.
So no deputy head teachers, but also no executive heads or leaders of academy chains. So it's the person in charge of the school on a day-to-day basis.
Yes, exactly. Absolutely. And it was focusing on secondary schools.
Indeed. So they all take children from age 11 to 16 or 11 to 18.
They do, but what, again, one of the things we found was that some of them, that was the starting point, but some of them then actually decided to take kids from earlier as well.
Absolutely. As is increasingly common in the English education system. So you've then got 160 schools that are keen to have you in. Did any of them throw you out halfway through when they got a new head? Because presumably they had the right to.
They did, they did. Everyone, was very open. And, and actually they were very curious to find out what's going on, and so we weren't a threat in any way whatsoever.
And that is my experience of head teachers. They want to do the best thing. They know that children only have one chance in life, and why wouldn't they be part of something that will improve their school? And one of the things that we did too was we're conscious, always the challenge when you do research in an organisation is to make sure as a researcher you aren't affecting it. Absolutely, and that's hard.
And it is difficult. So all of them, where it was possible, actually gave us remote access to their systems too. So we were able to minimise the number of times we had to go there.
So this is their management information system?
It is, yes.
That tells you about the staff and about the pupils.
It is, and again, there's always a sensitivity here that we never ever looked at personal information, and we never downloaded anything that could be personal. But from a researcher point of view, having worked now with a huge number of different organisations, the level of data that is tracked is phenomenal.
Yes, it is.
In most pieces of research I do, you would say, wouldn't it be lovely to look at this? But you can't, because the data's not there. Whereas when we were looking at it in schools, it's all there. Yeah.
And did the staff know that this was happening?
Yes, so we were very open that this was going on. I mean, we weren't. We would sort of communicate to everyone at the beginning that this was going on. They're very open. They knew what was happening. Again, it's such an intense experience when you're in that situation that I think in many ways they had bigger things to focus on than us. Yes, yeah.
And you went to visit the schools as well, I think, or you and your team?
That's right, yes. So of a team of 4 of us, one of the things that we made sure to do was to have 2 that were involved in site visits and data collection, and 2 that weren't.
Yes.
Because that helps remove any observer bias that might happen. Yes. And often the visits could be to conduct interviews, but they might just be because we've seen from the remote access the number of actions have been taken, and we just want to check that we've interpreted that correctly.
Yes.
So often the observation allows you to test the insight, or to confirm that you're correctly interpreting it. Yeah.
So I'm guessing that you didn't collect the data for 5 to 7 years and then think, okay, now we're going to analyse it. There's a point at which you start analysing.
Yes,
I'm guessing.
Yes, that's
that
right.
Then changes what you're looking for afterwards, which is both a strength and a danger.
Yes.
Do you want to explain how, at what point did you think, okay, we've got enough now to begin to form some hypotheses that we can then...
So the way we did it was we actually looked at initially the schools that made the biggest improvement.
Yep.
And we noticed that there were regional differences.
Yep.
It appeared much easier to turn around an urban school versus a rural or coastal one.
Yep.
And so what we did is we picked 2 cases, 2 that are in the city, 2 urban, 2 rural, 2 coastal, so 8 in total. And we then looked at them in a huge amount of detail.
Yep.
So we said, okay, month by month, what actions are taken?
Yep.
And what impact occurs? And what we started to see was there were a pattern of actions. And you started to see what different leaders were doing on that journey. And that allowed you to start to develop some hypotheses. So you could start to see, okay, this is happening for, people are changing staff. Okay, why are they changing staff? Is that to improve teaching capability or is that to reduce costs?
Yes.
And you see different reasons.
Yes.
So the really in-depth cases allowed us to look at lots of different factors. And we even also looked at not only those schools, but we looked at their competitors within a 2-mile radius, and we started to see what was going on with them too. So you could start to work out if the impact was just where the school was located and there was a change going on in that local area anyway, or they were a direct result of the actions being taken. So that was our starting point. Then we expanded from that out to 160 schools.
Yep.
And we noticed that one of the first actions taken in all schools was to change leadership.
Yes.
So,
and essentially that's required.
And so we said, okay, that seems to be very important.
Yes.
So let's now look at the leadership.
Yep.
And then we said, okay, from the 160 we've got, how many leaders were there over the time period? Okay, what data set does that give us?
Yep.
And then as we started to then look at that data set in more detail and started to cluster different actions and try and understand why they were taken through different beliefs. As we built our clusters up, we also kept looking at each one and saying, is that big enough now that we can be confident? So it was an organic process where it was sort of giving us the confidence to say, yes, this...
And when we think about how you clustered them, was this a really technical procedure, or was it a sort of, I'm going to, because a lot of your data is qualitative, it's interviews, it's observations, or is it a sense of saying, this school feels to me as though it's doing the same thing, I as a social researcher see a similar set of actions, or is it a more formulaic, quantitative, run a regression, run principal components, whatever it is? How did you do it at a technical level?
Yeah, at a technical level, so what we did is some of the data is qualitative, but some of it is quantitative. So the things which were quantitative were the actions. So you could say so we separated staff into teachers and support staff because we saw different things going on, and you can see changes in numbers. So that's quite clear.
Absolutely.
And you can see also changes in the number that leave, but also the number of them recruited. So you could say, okay, X number of staff have gone. 60% of the number that left were now recruited. This decision has been made partly to reduce numbers, but also partly to change the staff. So from a numerical point of view, you can get into you can see patterns.
But it's essentially an arithmetic way of seeing patterns.
It is.
This group make a lot of people redundant.
This
group make a lot of people redundant and rehire them, and so on.
Yes, you do. And then we actually predominantly use scatters to start to show numerically where different things sat. And what we started to notice was groupings emerging. So it wasn't that we put it through statistical software and the answer popped out.
From the black box.
It would be, for example, if we look at these sets of leaders, what percentage changes do they make to staff within the first 2 years? Let's group them into 0 to 10%, 10 to 20%, etc., etc. Put all of that onto a scatter diagram. Okay, now if we now colour those things differently, what clusters are there? Are there clusters or aren't there clusters? And which ones pop out and which ones don't?
And when I was on Econometrics 101 many years ago, we were taught to always plot the data. If you don't plot the data, you're vulnerable to make all sorts of mistakes.
And it's amazing how it's not always the case, but in this case, how much the clusters started to pop out. The big area of qualitative data was around beliefs.
Absolutely.
So it was getting in, and we had to learn how to get the right data. But the three key questions were the leader's belief about why schools fail, the leader's belief about how you improve them, and the leader's belief about their role in that process. Are they just there to kickstart it and then they move on to something else, or are they there for the whole journey? And what we did with those is we transcribed the interviews, and then we did some basic, the technical term is codifying. So we said, okay, when we look at the different transcripts we've got, what sort of reasons seem to be there, and we developed some first order codes, second order codes, and then we use those to basically again say, okay, this leader looks like they have that set of beliefs, these ones like that.
And how closely did the beliefs correlate with the actions that you see?
There was very clear links. What you do get though is you do get some leaders taking the same action but for different reasons. For example, we mentioned earlier the move to create an all-through school. Now, we found that some leaders did that because they wanted to increase revenue.
Absolutely.
And they knew that you need the resources and you need the resources for the journey. And their belief actually was that schools fail because they don't have enough resources.
And it also makes it more predictable because the children will stay on at 11 rather than you're having to go in the market and recruit them.
Exactly. However, other leaders recognised that there was a revenue or resources benefit, but their motivation actually was that they felt they could have greater impact on children if they taught them for a longer period. And one of the things they noticed was that with a secondary school, if you've got children feeding in from lots of different areas, it takes a while to stabilise that and to get that working. And so you're, out of say a 5-year period, you're losing at least a year. Just stabilising things.
Particularly in urban areas. In a rural area, they all come from the same schools every year.
That's
the way
right,
it
yes.
works.